What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to My Social Life. This is the podcast where you can hear the real stories behind the people on social media. I'm your host, Jacob Kelly. And before we jump into today's conversation with Javier and Mercedes, there's a couple things I would need to go over first. Number one, today's podcast is brought to you by Content Caviar. Content Caviar is my brand new monthly newsletter where I send you a recap of the best things I've watched, listened to, and read over the last 30 days. There's so much content being created right now. Let me cut through the noise and send you a list of deep content I enjoyed the most and found the most interesting in the last month. You can sign up at jacobkelly.ca. And if you enjoyed today's podcast, please consider leaving a rating and a review. The more positive ratings and reviews you get, the more it helps new people find this show, and it really helps to grow the community that we're developing here. And if you're one of those people that have recently found the podcast, welcome. I'm very excited to have you here. Make sure you subscribe and stay tuned for future episodes. And to everybody listening, make sure you screenshot this, post it to your Instagram story, tag myself and Javier, and I will feature you on the account and send you a message as well. And now, without further ado, let's get to my conversation with Javier Mercedes. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to My Social Life. This is the podcast where you can hear the real stories behind the people on social media. I'm your host, Jacob Kelly, and today we're joined by Javier Mercedes. And Javier is the host of the podcast Passion in Progress. He is a YouTuber with over 17,000 subscribers. And on top of that, in previous work, he's worked with people like Morgan Freeman, Julius Irving, Charles Barkley, the Property Brothers, and more. And I'm very excited to have him here on the podcast today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
I'm excited to have you here. I want to go all the way back to the beginning. So I mentioned in the intro, you have your own podcast. And if I'm not mistaken, when you were a kid, you used to do this thing called Goop Tapes, which was like you doing a radio show of your brothers playing video games.
Yeah. So I would record my brothers playing not me playing, but I would record my brothers playing Nintendo games. And you got to remember that this is way before anything like YouTube or SoundCloud or anything. This was completely on cassette tapes and an old radio. And what I would do is essentially have my own radio show that was just for me and my family, where my brothers would play video games like Mega Man and insert any normal Nintendo or Super Nintendo game right here. And I would have them play the level, but then just stand over in the corner, and I would hit the record button so I could record the music. And it's kind of weird because if you fast forward to today, I mean, you can find anything on the internet, but live streaming is so huge of video games. And I was kind of hosting my own show, but a radio version of that when I was a little kid. It's kind of weird that I don't do Twitch or anything. I mean, maybe I'll do something like that in the future, but I would record my brothers playing the video game, and I would say, this is like the music to Mega Man level 1. And then after that, I would insert like a little radio thing, like that was level 1 on Mega Man, go to the next level, and then like record that and jump cut it in the cassette tape itself, and have these thing called Goobs tapes, where it was just me recording my brothers playing video games, but it was just really the Nintendo music.
That's awesome. So as a kid, what inspired you to want to do that? Because ultimately, you ended up, your career has involved audio from that point on. It's what inspired you? What encouraged you to do that at such a young age?
So my dad was a musician, and I basically was following in his footsteps in terms of, he is one of those guys that can pick up a guitar and play anything by ear, and or piano and play that by ear. And I was kind of drawn to that as a kid. And I would say, so my dad's Hispanic. He grew up in the DR, and he obviously is bilingual now, along with a lot of my family. But I myself didn't really, I took Spanish in high school and did okay in it. And I'd say the rest of my family is basically bilingual. I have a whole bunch of I have one sister and a whole bunch of brothers. All of them speak Spanish and English very well. I myself am so. But what I do is I feel like I took on the attributes of music in terms of learning that as a language. Since when I went to college for audio, and I think instead of getting the whole Spanish part of my I guess heritage I went like the music route from my dad and kind of acquired all of that.
And so you, with that musical background, you were in a band in high school called Bandcamp, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, Bandcamp's the website. I was in
Gotcha.
a band called Groove Shelter, and that was my high school band.
Gotcha. And then so you ended up having to play when you went to school, you had to play an instrument to get in, right?
Yeah, yeah. I had uh I had 3 trials to do to get into the School of Music, and it was one of the hardest things I've done in my life. But the short story is, in order to get into the School of Music, you have to be at a certain caliber of musician and music theory and all those things. And it took me 3 auditions to get into the School of Music. Um, but ultimately, like now in my life, I do things like video editing. And for the listeners, I think one of the biggest things that I got out of my music degree, and for the whole argument's sake of, is it worth it to go to college for anything in media related? So for those that don't know, now I do freelance video editing. Recently, I had a sports documentary that I was editing on for ESPN that got nominated for an Emmy. I've worked with Fox, ABC, ESPN, and a couple other things like that. But I was the senior video editor at the Chive for about 4 years, and before that, I was an audio engineer at Doppler Studios. And the reason I bring this up is because my music education that I got at Ball State, I've been thinking about this lately, is that it taught me about format. And what I mean by that is music theory in general. What music theory has taught me is that there are rules when you're creating music. And when you have constraint, it actually breeds more creativity because you're putting a set of rules in place that is kind of a guideline for you to just start. I find it so much easier to create things when you are when you put something forth that, like, say in music theory, if you have a chord structure that's 1 4 5, and that could be G, then F chord, then or sorry, C, then F, then G, then C. And in pop music, you hear this chord structure all the time, but that whole chord structure is there because our ears are kind of trained to like that, like hearing the resolution in music and things of that nature. And when you have that structure in place, it's so much easier to approach a project creatively, um, to know that, all right, I don't even know what I want to write down on this paper. I don't know what I want to do when I'm going to hit the keys to create the notes, or I don't know when I got all of this footage into my edit bay, or even with a podcast or any type of creation. Where do you start? Well, if you have a set of guidelines, it at least helps you in that beginning process. And I think in terms of, well, I learned a lot from my music education, but I think the biggest thing was that if you have the format, and then there's the cliche rules are meant to be broken, it's nice to actually have the rules in place to know where to start.
I've heard Tyler Babin say a similar thing about constraints allowing you to create better, and a lot of people
Guess
think
who
that.
told him that?
Yeah, that's awesome. No way.
So I was interviewing Alex Gasaway, and we were at Alex Gasaway's apartment, and this was right when Babin met Alex Gasaway, and I was interviewing her first, and then I talked about that same exact thing. So when he came out with that video, I was like, huh. Babin, where'd you get that idea from? But yeah, man, Babin's awesome. He's such a cool guy.
That's hilarious. That's awesome. Yeah, Babin. I've only messaged him on Instagram a couple times, but Alex has been on my podcast before. She's super cool too.
Yeah,
Um,
both of them. I'm not really taking a jab at Babin. I'm pretty sure he came up with that like on his own thing. But I just remember when before he came out with that video, uh we had the same concept. And if you look, I have a video on my channel where I have a brief interview with Babin and a couple other YouTubers like Matt Divella and Samir Chaudhry and a couple others when I was at Vid Summit. And I think Babin even brings up that concept of constraint breeds creativity.
Interesting. So I'm sure a lot of people here now, kind of after just touching on your background a little bit, they're curious as to how you fell into video editing. As someone that was in audio editing, what then led to that transition of you becoming a video editor?
Just brute. Like, so I, it's weird answering questions like this because I'm like, oh, there's so many aspects in my brain that want to talk about different things. But here's what's going on in my head right now. I was just filming with, I got asked to do be a sound mixer on a live set. So for those that don't know, that's the person with like the boom pole and the little bag in front of them, and they have the audio. They're recording the audio on set. And I haven't done something like that for a little bit of time. I used to do a lot of it just run and gun when I was at the Chive, just because our media department would be creating original content and we'd have to do that. But the kind of technology that we were using wasn't very, it was like Zoom recorders and things like that. And this was the very first time where I was using a sound devices recorder. And it got me to thinking of like, oh man, this, like when I see people on set, like if you're in Hollywood or New York and you're doing those big budget films, like a sound devices recorder is one of the state of the art things. I know this is super tangential to your question, but I'm getting there. And when I saw that, another piece of advice to the audience that I would say is that when you get approached to do something that may be out of your comfort zone, in my experience, it's always best to be completely honest with whoever is hiring you. So the situation was that, do you know Rachel Hollis? She's a podcaster.
Don't believe so.
Okay, so she has the Rise podcast, but she also has a big media presence here in Austin, or a big like media team as a part of that, and she's now doing stuff for Quibi, and asked me to come along, or they asked me to stand in for one of their sound recordists, and when they called me up, they're like, "Hey, here's the setup." I knew one of the other people that was a part of the media department, and they're like, "Oh, Javier knows how to do sound." And for me, like I know all the things about music theory, all of the, well, not everything, but like all of the like audio, acoustics, physics things, and whatever that may be. But I have never used this specific device before, the sound devices, which is ironic that it has devices in the name. And on the phone call, they were like, "Hey, we need you to step in for this other person because this other person has other gigs that he needs to do." And from this point, I've kind of stepped into like video editing and like shooting video mostly. And I was like, okay, just to let you know, like I only know how to use like the Zoom F8, which is like a higher end audio recorder. And then they're like, "Oh, well, we use the sound devices thing." And right when I heard that, I was like, okay, I don't know how to use that, but I mean, obviously I know all the technical things. And on the other side was the other sound recorder, and he was like, "It's okay. I mean, I'm pretty sure that I can teach you what you need to know within like a day." So they gave me a day of training on that thing, and I was able to, I was able to like get by and like do the stuff in the production. But the reason I was brought all of this up was because like going into the different realms, I was in audio and I was talking to the guy that was teaching me the stuff on that new device, and I had this same conversation with him where now I'm coming from kind of only video background stuff now, and most of the audio stuff I do now is the podcast. And I was talking to him because this guy, I came to find out, was a producer for Travis, Astro Stadium, Travis Barker.
Travis Scott.
It's Travis Scott. Thank you. Travis Scott. And he was like, he like did a whole bunch of major budget, like he's a producer and he's also like a boom operator for like these really, really big things. And I was like, oh wow, I'm getting like trained by this really awesome dude. And he was like super down to earth in talking about stuff, but I had this conversation with him about like why I kind of made the switch from audio to video, and a lot of it had to do with like the black magic that goes on with I want to say like audio in general. So I think that when you're talking or you're doing something, there are people out there that are like, and you may be one of them, but there are people out there that are just like really, 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 they know a lot about the science behind sound and like sampling rates. And if you build a capacitor and a resistor, when you put that into a signal chain, what that does to an audio signal and things like that. And for me, with video, what I really love is that when you do something to something in the edit bay, or whether you do it on the camera, you can physically see the difference that you're making to the product that you're creating. Whereas with sound, it's still a physical thing that you're changing, but it's so much more of an elusive, non-tangential thing that you can't like touch or see, if that makes any sense.
No, that does make a lot of sense. That like, especially too for like for as you said, there's people that understand the difference when it comes to audio, but for a lot of people, they might not be able to differentiate between audio that someone's just touched a little bit versus someone that's done a lot of work editing that audio versus video. You can clearly tell the difference, like you said. So was it so with that in mind, kind of how like when did you first start editing video? And like how long had you been like did you get to a point where you were just kind of done with audio and you just didn't want to do it anymore? Like how does that switch happen then for you?
It's kind of both. But by no means am I like done with audio. I would say one of my strengths is that I have audio background in video when it comes to video editing. And a lot of what's weird about that is a lot of other video editors that I know that are successful are people that also have a music background, which is weird. Not, I guess not weird, but I think there's a lot of similarities there with what I was talking about earlier in terms of once you understand a certain component about like music theory, then or different aspects of how creation happens, I think there's a lot of overlap there that you can take to video production, especially when it comes to editing video to music. There's a lot that you can garner by chopping up a song a specific way that if you were producing a song in Pro Tools, you can take that same approach to video editing, where instead of seeing certain waveforms hit at a specific time, you can now add a third dimension to it, which would be the visual aspect. So instead of just chopping up the song to create a new song, now you're chopping up the song to create a new song and adding a visual aspect to it, kind of hitting all senses except, I guess, smell. But the initial jump for me was I was at Doppler Studios, and I was doing this was my audio recording job in Atlanta, and I was recording ADR, which for those that don't know is I believe it stands for audio dialogue replacement. It may stand for something else, but for when you're recording a movie, there might be a siren or somebody coughs, or you sit down in a chair while somebody's saying a line and then it makes a noise. In fact, I just removed a noise like that yesterday for a film that I was working on. And that those kind of simple things that people don't notice on the back end, because post production editors are taking those I guess artifacts out of the production, so you get a cleaner experience when you're watching something or listening to something. That's what I was doing in the background. I would do stuff like that, and then I would also record audiobooks. I would record commercials, like straight up what you would think when you're like, get 0% off APR on your blah blah blah, with all that kind of stuff. Like I was recording all that material, and a lot of it was great because I got to work with some really 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 big name people, but it also wasn't fulfilling in the aspect of I'm literally just a person that's in a room hitting a record button and making sure stuff doesn't break. Now I'm sure there's a lot of differences, or there's a lot of similarities there too. A lot of different jobs where instead of like hitting a record button, you're making sure things just run smoothly behind a computer. But for me, it wasn't creatively fulfilling. So that's part of the reason why I moved from doing the recording to video. Plus, I just when I picked up a Canon 7D and saw how you could kind of get like a cinematic look for cheap back in the day. It was so much better. It was like, oh man, I can manifest my creative juices that are in my brain and like actually put them into a visual format. So it started out probably with, like a lot of other people, with uh like doing weddings or just taking out my camera and filming things and just putting together pieces on Vimeo because I didn't think that they would do anything about copyright, when in all honesty, if you posted a video on YouTube by this time, now the other person just like takes the royalties. Like Vimeo took down a lot of my videos that I posted on my original page that had copyright music on them.
Got you. And then so it was from there then where you moved. So you were in Atlanta at Doppler, and then it was from there that you made the jump to Austin and worked at the Chive.
Yep. Yep.
So like what led like how does that opportunity come up? Because the Chive like what is a very renowned like notable company, and so is Doppler. But like how do you make the jump from one notable company to another? Like how does that opportunity come up?
I actually wasn't going to take the job at the Chive, but the short answer is my brother is the head of their charity. So Chive Charities is the charity aspect of the Chive, which is a big component of what they do at the Chive. And when I said I was moving to Austin, I really wanted to pursue doing freelance everything, and they just I'm at that point I really wasn't I hadn't had any professional, well, I had some professional like video experience, but it wasn't like anything to write home about. And here is a full-time job offered to me that's like, hey, do you want to do video things for our company? And it's like, it's basically, do you want to get paid to like learn all the video things? And obviously it's like not something that I could pass up. So the short story is that it's um one, the founders of the Chive went to my same high school, but two, my brother already worked there, so I had somebody that was able to give me or put in a good word for me.
Got you. And then can you kind of like how would you summarize your 4 years to the Chive? I know you ended up editing their podcast, you did over 90 episodes, you did stuff with Mark Cuban, John Cena. What are like some of your takeaways or the key highlights or moments from your time at the Chive?
Well, I still work with them in a freelance capacity. They recently they've made the pivot to Chive TV, and when I was with them, they had a bigger emphasis on original content and sponsored content. But with good reason, they kind of allocated the funds that were going to that and switched it over to Chive TV. And if people haven't seen Chive TV, what it is basically the internet on your TV. It's like just viral videos and other basically stuff that you can't take your eyes away from uh, on a TV when you're at a bar or some public space. So they've now changed it to Atmosphere TV. And even if you go to your gas station now, it's on gas station TV. So if you were at your pump long enough and your TV in your gas pump has a TV, you will probably see a clip from Chive TV pop up. When I saw that, I was like, whoa. But yeah, uh what I learned there was I would say basically everything about my video editing career, besides what I picked up from editing audio. There's this my supervisor for most of the time while I was there, Andy Fenberg, basically like just taught me all the things. Like a lot of the tutorials and other things that I do online were some sort of like thing that I may have learned from him or other people while I was there. But the biggest thing that I got from it was, as our department grew, I was able to teach other people how to video edit and how to shoot video. And I really enjoyed that aspect of the filmmaking process. And the thing that really didn't appeal to me in terms of going higher up in the company was becoming like a producer. And for some reason, I just like I love the concept of being able to produce your own content. I mean, obviously that's what I do on my YouTube channel, but it's kind of weird when you're in that infrastructure because it's not just the whole creative aspect. I have so much respect for people that produce in a corporate setting because you have to appease so many parties. You have to put together call sheets. You have to keep everybody organized, and it may sound like it's you're basically a manager of a media team, and I didn't know what it meant to if you were watching credits and you see like produced by such and such. But now I definitely understand all of the hats that a producer role what a producer holds on something that is media related, and it's basically they do everything. And for me, I just wasn't like that didn't really appeal to me. So I kind of stuck to being a video editor and somebody that shoots the video and seeing how far I could basically just how much can I pour into this and also help the others around me. So I to answer your question, it was very much what I learned while I was there was uh all of the experiences in terms of every single day you get a new project thrown at you. In a lot of I would say like when you're looking at a public media company like VaynerMedia, uh, they're creating content every single day, and you can see on the back end through his vlogs kind of what that would look like. Well, at the Chive, it was similar, obviously on a different kind of scale. In every single day, you are it's like it's either a sponsored piece of content, it's a charity piece, it's a beauty piece, it's a apparel piece to accentuate some sort of clothing that they might be having through their clothing line, or now you're promoting some other aspect, and then next would be some like kind of Netflix style mini doc that they were producing. It was fulfilling in a way that creatively I was getting a different kind of genre of piece to create and mold a story around every single day and every single week. And when I wasn't when you're in the middle of doing those stories and those podcasts and all those other things, you're also surrounded by like-minded individuals that are also working on different projects. It was really cool. Um, and so I would say like the whole thing that I got out of it was the 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 overall experience of getting to work on so many different projects in a short amount of time.
And when you were there working on all these different projects that at the same time you decide to start your YouTube channel in 2017, and where I'm working towards is you going daily in I believe it was November of 2017 while still working at the Chive. But before we get to that point, I want to ask, how long does it take to make a 35-second stop motion video?
Like my I think that's it's not my it's like my fourth video, or like I don't know what are you referencing my blue versus green guy video?
I am, yeah. When your YouTube channel
I
probably would have
know.
still been your channel probably would have still been called Goob Stuff at that time, if I'm not
Yeah,
mistaken.
yes, it was. That was an interesting time. So basically, I completely forget what you're. I feel like I've like kind of answered your questions, but just gone into my own little stories. If that's okay.
That's
But
okay, yeah.
the story behind that is if you were to go into my YouTube channel way deep down, there is a stop motion video where it's the blue guy versus the green guy, and the story like the cool thing about that whole piece was I had a like I want to say like 2 month period where I was I had just left my job at my recording studio, and I was like basically hadn't picked up my contract to go work at the Chive, and I was working I like had enough saved up where I was just like, oh, I'm just going to do whatever creatively and just like kind of live out my lease at the apartment for like 2 months. So that stop motion video was like, oh, I have time to make a stop motion video. So here's me just trying to learn how to do stop motion for the time being. Um and that's how that video came about. I wouldn't say it took me like half a day, but I really don't remember. I just remember like the music in the background was mine, and that was the Sony RX 103, which my brother had, and now I have the Sony RX 104. But I remember just playing with that camera and being like, you got to remember that I'm used to huge bulky things like the Canon 7D, and have a little point and shoot come out with like better visuals than my Canon 7D, and be able to like make things was really cool. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, no, I was just curious because from my understanding, like YouTube to you prior to you really starting on it was just a place where you'd go to learn like how to fix a door handle or a door hinge or something like that, and not so much as a creator. So I was just curious as like the early days of how you use YouTube prior to actually becoming a creator. And then in
Holy
2017 you
cow.
started.
That's such a great concept. So what you're talking about, the learning capacity on YouTube, where when I because I was coming out with videos at that time, but I wasn't releasing them. Like I said earlier, I wasn't releasing them on YouTube. Like I was coming out with vlogs and everything. I was posting them on my Vimeo page. And then when I created something that was like my own orchestration and like my own visuals, then I posted it on YouTube. I think it really came more from the fact of I like I said before, I didn't know what the rules were around copyright, and I just didn't want to like mess with it. So I Vimeo was the place where if you had like a wedding video, but then you use copyright music, like you would post it on Vimeo instead of YouTube. And life has gotten so much easier with things like Epidemic Sound and even YouTube's audio library, because now you can post music in the background and not have to worry about getting your getting sued or any of that kind of stuff.
Mhm. But kind of where I was originally, sorry, where I was leading to, even prior to asking the question about the stop motion video, was when you were still at the Chive and you were doing all these different projects. In November of 2017, you decided to go daily on YouTube. Why did you decide to do that? And what was that month like of working full time and posting daily at the same time?
Horrible. It was horrible in terms of my relationship with my family, and I probably will never go daily again. But it was the most fulfilling thing creatively. It I would say my month of doing daily was the most that I've ever gotten to the point of not caring about what I'm posting, in a sense of this very first one of the first concepts that I brought up is that constraint breeds creativity. So you post, you have the rule of I have to post every single day. So now you just start working around that, and you just have to say F it to anything that comes up that, like, all right, my computer isn't working right now. Well, you have a cell phone. I'm going to just record me talking on my cell phone and post that. Granted, this is much easier to do when you don't have as many subscribers. I will admit it's so much easier to to do a task like this. And I say that with a grain of salt because there's nothing stopping me from doing like content like that on my channel now. But I think for myself, I am at the point where I want to have a happy medium of what is the most valuable for the people that are watching and listening to my content, and also fulfilling for me. And at this point, it's like, all right, if I do gear reviews, video editing tutorials, and interviews like this, that's fulfilling on both ends, because I try and get as much value as I can to whoever is taking the time out of their day to watch my stuff. But before, with the daily thing, it was just like, how can I expedite the process of learning how to do this whole YouTube thing? And going daily is something that will do that. No, like, that's just go daily. If you want to get good at YouTube, just go daily, and it will force you to be. It will get you so much better at it in the long run. Now, what I was mentioning before was that, like, I got to the point where, like, because I'm going daily, I'm not spending as much. I have 2 kids now at this point, and I wasn't spending as much time with them. I wasn't spending as much time with my wife. And then as that progressed, uh, and it's just not fair that my wife would have to watch the kids so much or do all that stuff, um, and kind of having a blind eye to it. And then after the whole 30 days, or I forget how many days of whatever month that I was doing was there, then it was like, oh, okay. One, I'm not getting any sleep, and two, now I'm just turning into a horrible father slash husband. So I give much props to the people that go daily and to those that support them in their family, because I feel like it's a challenge in and of itself to live a balanced life, whatever that term may be for you, when you're doing something like that.
Mhm. Would you recommend someone do daily based on your experiences? I'm always curious.
Yes.
Yes? Yeah?
Yes. And again, that was my experience. For other people, it could be a completely different experience. Like, you got to remind I for me, I think I reached this point where I was creating content for other people, which I was getting satisfaction from, but I wasn't creating content for me. And it was f- it could be a completely different game changer for somebody to say, like, they might be a mechanic or a carpenter or whoever or perfect case in point is you could be a chef, and you want to do something else creatively in your free time. That could be a completely different outlet, and you could get so much more fulfillment, like I did, by creating for yourself as opposed for other people. Now, the neat thing about YouTube is that you are creating for yourself, but at a certain point, you can monetize it.
And you mentioned your podcast there, and I do want to talk about that a little bit. But before you launched your podcast, you did this thing called Interv Wednesday. Was that kind of your way of dabbling with the idea of a podcast but not committing to one?
Yeah. Let me ask you, for your podcast, how did you come up with the name?
My social life, honestly. So I always tell people this story with my podcast is I had the idea for it, and then I asked for a bunch of gear for Christmas, and I sat on it, and I didn't really like know any idea around the podcast. And then I don't remember how I specifically came up with the name, but it was just 6 months of me putting it off until I eventually started it. But I can't remember where the name itself came from, if I'm being completely honest.
Yeah, I would say that's the exact thing that happened with Interv Wednesday in my podcast. I think it was just, I wanted a way of interviewing people for my YouTube channel, or showcasing different people's talents and other people's passions. But I had no idea what to call it or what to do with it. And we had this show at the Chive called Blue Collar. There are 3 videos that we came out with. One was a steel worker, second was a golf club maker, and third was a shrimp boat person. And if you were to go and look at those videos, they are more the Netflix style documents. It's basically like it was my introductory course for myself into, like, how to make those kind of documentaries, like premium style kind of docs, that helped lead to the kind of jobs that I'm working on now. And once I had the opportunity to work on those kind of videos, I was hooked. So I wanted to take that whole process. And once I found out that we really weren't going to keep pursuing making that kind of content at the Chive, I wanted to somehow start making that for myself. And that's how Interv Wednesday was born, which was an interview on a Wednesday. And it helped me do a couple different things. This is before my podcast, so it helped me to start interviewing people, and having an excuse to, like, get in the room to interview with people. And then second, it helped in that production capacity of being a producer. So on the back end, I was like, I don't know if I'm ready for producing, because, like, everything that I was saying before. And I was like, well, if I wanted to maybe start producing, or whatever that role may be, to further myself in my career, I really need to get better at the whole interviewing, or just creating my own story in a video, as opposed to receiving notes from someone and footage, and then sculpting a story around that with my own twist on it. Interv Wednesday helped me do that. and there's a couple other aspects there, but it was a great creative outlet outside of my own I guess tutorials and all that stuff and what I was doing at the Chive. For those that what this eventually turns into was, instead of calling it Interv Wednesday, which is it's still a great name for it, it turned into Passion and Progress, which is now the name of my podcast.
And early on, you said the podcast was a way for you to have meaningful conversations, but I've heard you say that it's evolved into so much more now. So how would you describe or explain your podcast?
I mean, I, I love getting these questions from a fellow podcaster, because I want to ask the question to you, like, what is the biggest thing after interviewing so many people? What has it meant to you?
It's hard. I mean, early on, so when I started, I guess now that I'm talking out loud, I'm thinking on it more. Where the name My Social Life came from is obviously the podcast has the angle of talking about social media, and the whole intent behind it was to teach people how to grow by talking to people that have grown on social media. And then I was also going to doubly use those tips and tactics for myself. But as I noticed as I went on doing these interviews and these conversations, I got more feedback on the story of the person more so than the tips and the tactics and all that stuff. So it kind of pivoted over time to more so not just trying to talk over and over and over again about how to grow on Instagram or what should you make your YouTube thumbnails look like, to focus more so on that person and their story. And of course, still mention some of the tips and tactics that they've used, but not make it the focus of the podcast, and more so care about the person and their story. That's kind of how mine has changed over the last 91 episodes.
Oh my gosh. You're, that's interesting, because mine's the complete opposite. So I think my experience has been that okay, let me put it this way. After doing the podcast for I think I'm on 80 something now. I get a lot from the people's story, but for me, I think there's a couple different aspects that come with doing the podcast. I think the biggest one is that you extend your network. You have an excuse to talk to new people. Like, there's no way I would have known who you were unless hey, now we're doing this podcast. And after this, it's like, now I'm going to be like following you on social media. And then every single time you post, you have those interactions with those people. And then you keep, I want to say that you keep in touch with people, even though you may have never met them in person, which is like kind of weird that you can do that in today's day and age, but that's what happens. So you extend your network, and it's like, oh, hey, I'm friends with so and so, like what we were just talking about with like when I went to Vid Summit, I got to I've already worked with Alex, but then I got to meet Babin and a couple other people, and now I have like a actual, like, I can talk to them in a way that, like, oh, hey, they know who I am and that kind of thing. So I think doing the podcast kind of opens up those doors, and I think that's more of like a selfish, if I'm being honest, like way of doing, or not way of doing, but that's one of those things that helps out a person personally by doing a podcast.
I was going to say, you're absolutely right. And that's one thing I always tell people, that even if my podcast, it could get 0 downloads, but I made a connection with a human being I never would have met had I not done the podcast. It's another really good point that I forgot to bring up, that absolutely the connection is one of the biggest pieces with the podcast.
Yeah. And I don't think that's one of the things that like gets said enough. Well, I think actually, no, I think people just know that, like, if people are starting a podcast, they know what they're getting into. They're getting into like the networking business. And there's part of me that also realizes that in podcasting, there's also another aspect of in one of my somebody like wrote me a DM once, or I posted about a podcast, or like I posted one of my podcasts, and then they commented on it about how most podcasts nowadays are someone coming on the podcast and then them talking about something, and it's really just about a promotion for whatever that product may be. And for me, I was like, yeah, that's pretty much what it is. And then But if you look at like late night show hosts and other things like that, most of the time when somebody goes on one of those shows, it's because they're promoting their movie, or they're promoting their book, or they're promoting some like product that came out, or whatever that may be. And but at the other end of that spectrum is, most of the time whatever that product or service is something that these people really stand behind, or something that these people are really trying, like they're trying to provide value to other people. And it's another aspect of like, if is it like haters gonna hate because somebody's like trying to do something with their life. And because of the concept of what my podcast is, Passion in Progress, it's people passionate about what they're doing. So obviously when people come in, I find that if you are passionate about whatever that thing is, it's easy for them to explain it in a way for people to get. So what I'm getting at with there is, yes, there's the like networking thing, but there's also the promotional aspect. I think those are two concepts that, I don't want to say dark, but it's like something that people don't like. You don't want to like take that away from what happens in podcasting. It's just a great networking device, because now you have a personal connection with whoever that person is, and you can provide value to whoever the audience is. So where I was going with that is that, for me, the stories are a part of that person's history in any interview that I'm doing. But now I'm actually trying to get more towards value given to the audience in the shortest amount of time possible. So I found in my analytics that if you have a big enough guest, people are going to stick around and just listen, because they're interested in that person's story. But then if you have somebody that is a very specialized person in a specific aspect of, say, social media, email marketing, whatever that may be, people don't really care about, and I'm making generalizations here, people don't really care about that person's story more than they just really want to know what are the 5 tips that this person can provide. And I think the happy medium there is a perfect case in point. Of this is when I emailed, when I interviewed the email marketer for rev.com. He like if you've ever used rev.com or you get their emails, they're really good. They're really witty, and it's like almost like a meme, but it's what you wouldn't expect from a transcribing service. And what he would do is tell a story that backed up the value that he's trying to bring to the audience. So I think what I've been trying to do recently is at least try and provide some sort of lesson with the story that I'm providing. And I don't know if I'm doing that right now. We can keep tally in this podcast, but I've actually been rethinking like how my podcast is formatted, where it's like, all right, if I approach a conversation and just say, hey, what are 5 things that we can talk about that would provide value to the listener in this way, some way, shape, or form, and then just stick to those. So you're in and then you're out. I try and like the biggest one to me is Daryl Eves and Ricky Ray Butler's podcast, Creative Disruption. That podcast has like story-driven stuff, but it's very much geared towards people that do YouTube and media entertainment things. And the topics that they talk about are kind of like algorithmic, but in the sense that they're so practical and so good about keeping, if the person's story is pertinent to the information, it's there. But if not, they're really good at segueing it into value-driven pieces. I try and look at the statistics behind my viewer duration and look at, all right, when are people dropping off in the podcast? Hopefully people are still listening here, but in trying to gauge like, okay, if people are still listening to this, if they dropped off, why did they drop off at that certain point? And if that's the information that I'm getting, how can I change that?
No, that's true. And kind of as you're talking here, I'm also analyzing my podcast at the same time with the information you're giving me here. And I feel like now that I've almost over indexed too far in one direction, where I've leaned too far into stories and not enough into the tactical side. So now you've got me reevaluating my podcast here as we do this
I
podcast. It's
so
super interesting.
I yeah, I am it's me. Like I don't know, like for you, in the way that you're approaching the questions and everything, it's so interesting to me because obviously you've done your research and you're asking me all of these amazing questions, but that's a lot of stuff. And I don't like, for me it's a lot of like questions for me and for people to learn about me. And if people are interested in that, like awesome. But on the other spectrum, I try and think of it in terms of if I were to come to an interview like this, what is something that immediately I would want to tell the audience that's like valuable in terms of like regardless of if I had a certain history or not. And if it's I don't know if it's valuable enough with enough information up front, then maybe segueing into story things. But I don't know if that's the magic bullet. The biggest thing would just be to get user feedback, and I think that's one of the things where I'm like scared of, but also at the same time, it's like if you don't get critiques on how you make your podcast, then I don't know how you grow. And for me, I'm like, how do you ask your podcast listeners, like, please be nice, but don't like roast me in terms of like, do I send out uh I guess like Instagram questions like how do I make my podcast better? Like what is and like most of the time I just get positive comments back from people, and then if you ever get like a negative comment, it just like burns and you're like, I don't like, you don't know how hard it is making this podcast, blah blah blah, like all that kind of stuff. It like it's a vicious cycle where constructive criticism is nice, but at the same time you're like, I don't know where I'm going with
Yeah,
this.
but speaking of your audience, I was curious too, with the premise of your podcast being interviewing people about their passions. One tip I often hear when it comes to podcasting is have a niche and have a defined niche. How has that worked or not worked for you as someone whose guests can differ so greatly because it's just passion is the key element that ties them all together?
Oh, it's good in terms of any like I can approach anyone kind of for the podcast, but it stinks in terms of uh what I would want to do. I mean, if you go and look at I don't know when this podcast is going to be released, but I haven't come out with a podcast for maybe a month or two, and it was actually right when the pandemic started. And part of that was all my podcasts were done in person. My very last one was done remotely, but I mean that's no excuse to not be producing, but I kind of got burnt out on the fact of like uh putting together the podcast, and then also on the other end doing my freelance work and doing my other YouTube channel. I talked to Sean Cannell of Think Media when I was at Vid Summit, and I already knew this, but he was like, the biggest recommendation that I can give to you is split the channel up. Like you should have an interview channel, and you should have like your YouTube tutorial gear review type stuff like that. It's two different concepts. And I was like, oh man, that hurts. I had just to try and pursue two different mediums. So at this point, at one point I was doing three different, and there were I'm trying to provide value in terms of like what has happened to me. At one point I was doing 3 videos a week. On Monday was a video tutorial in Premiere Pro. On Wednesday was my podcast, an hour-long podcast. On Friday was a gear review or some other thing that happened to be in like the production environment, something that I learned or something to do with filmmaking. And it was nice, but like I can see the analytics on the back end. And for me, everything that ended up happening with the podcast is maybe I get an initial amount of views. Podcasts create a great amount of watch time, not too many views though, and it's great for the whole networking aspect. But my other 2 types of videos, the gear reviews and the tutorials and everything, kept getting views. They still keep getting views. And I just looked at it and I said to myself, if I keep creating more of the other two pieces of content and not the podcast on this channel, that means those videos will still continue to get views for years on end. And I'm seeing that in my analytics now after stopping about 2 months ago. So I was kind of like hitting this wall where I just couldn't keep up with the pace that I was putting out content. And that was to my standards at this point, which is kind of contradicting what I was saying before about like, oh, go daily. But for me, the fact that I could still, those videos that I was doing that were tutorials or reviews could still work for me for months and months and months on end, had so much more value for me than pursuing the podcast full tilt at this time. Now, I will say now I have like an itch to do the podcast content again, and I've already started my second channel, and I have a couple podcasts on there that are still getting views, which is great because it's still bringing in subscribers and everything to that channel while I'm not really posting on it. So when I do start to post on it again, there's a bigger audience there to receive it. But I don't even know if I answered your question. I don't know where I was going with that. But the big thing that I wanted to get across here is that I think what a lot of people want to do is like do a podcast, do the YouTube channel, do like the Gary V technique, just like pump out content. And that's what I was doing for a very long time. And being a video editor and kind of having that as a thing on my channel, it brought up like I wanted a certain aesthetic to all my videos. And in order to do that, I was kind of getting burnt out on doing so much content at once. So now instead of doing so much, now I'm somewhat only posting once a week on my channel. But it's something that I'm like doing way more research on before I post the video. Like I'm spending so much more time on every single word that goes into a title, every single aspect that goes into a thumbnail, far before I even record the video. Whereas before, if you are doing something daily, you're in a reaction state and you're just recording. And then you're like, okay, how do I create a story out of this? Where now I'm creating something where I'm like, what is something that I want to make a video about that is searchable, that people will want to watch? And I guess that's the kind of format that I'm creating right now. And I haven't found a way to do that with the podcast, which is, I guess, is a roundabout way of answering your question of the whole niche thing on my Passion and Progress. I've actually thought about like changing the name because I want to focus more on what I'm doing on my YouTube channel to relate more towards my podcast channel, and having the ability to have self podcasts where I can actually give the information that I want to. I think one of the biggest things with YouTube is, especially with me being a video editor, when I say something and it's much better to show whatever I'm saying, it takes so much more time. Let's say a Premiere Pro tutorial. I go in, I create a Premiere Pro tutorial about, I don't know, well, let's take one for that I just did, how to record a VO in Premiere Pro. I can tell you how to do that on camera. It could be really boring if I was just sitting in front of the camera and then just telling you how to do it. It could also be really boring if I'm just in front of, if I'm just showing you a screen of Premiere Pro and then just going through the process of how to record a VO in Premiere Pro. But there's other aspects there where it's like, okay, how about if you zoom into wherever it is, and then if you cut back to me, and then I punch in on the shot on me, and then I punch out. It's all these little aspects that add up on each other that can show and tell the viewer how to do this in an efficient way. Now I'm thinking about that so much more, and I just can't achieve that with the podcast. A perfect case in point right now is how long I've been talking. Like I've been talking for a very long time, and in my brain, I'm thinking like, if I were to chop this up for a bite-sized, snackable piece of content for somebody to learn something from, how how could you chop that down into something even more efficient for people to listen to watch, or anything like that? In these longer conversations, I know that the aspect of it is to be more freeform. So as I keep talking, there's more things that come up in my head. But at the same time, I'm more geared towards like, how do I have a conversation with someone and still extract the value out of it in an efficient manner for the listener? And I think that is wherein lies where some people really succeed in podcasting and others falter. And sometimes like people's stories are just really, really interesting. Like if you have a podcast guest like Steve-O, we had him on the Chive podcast. Obviously that guy's got stories for days, and he's an amazing dude. But I'm not like jumping off of bridges butt naked or anything like that. So yeah.
Oh, I know we're a little over time here. I have 2 questions left for you.
I'm good if you want to keep going, but go ahead.
Cool. I was gonna ask, as a creator, obviously, I know you fell into the no small creator movement for a while, and 17, I believe around 17,500 subscribers on YouTube. That's not a small subscriber base compared to a lot of people. But as a creator who doesn't make all their money from just their YouTube channel, is there ever any self-doubt as to what you're doing, and how do you kind of overcome that self-doubt?
Okay, so the biggest, it's kind of, this is a great question. There's a couple of aspects that I want to address with it, and I'm probably going to forget what I really want to address. Stick with me if people are still listening, please. First thing that I want to point out is how I asked this same question in my last podcast that was posted. It wasn't the same question, but I think what's really going is an idea of imposter syndrome, and this is a concept that anybody can talk about. It's like you can get cliched quotes and all that stuff, but the biggest piece of information that I garnered from this was when I was interviewing Matt, who is Matt Johnson, and we have content that overlaps. And I straight up, I asked him like, hey, like, what is your idea behind you have one of the most viewed videos on creating proxies, video proxies. And if people that don't know, video proxies are a shorter, I want to say a smaller size video format. So when you're editing videos, say something like a 4K raw footage, you can create a proxy, which is a stand-in file that you can work with in your computer. But then when you go to export, it actually references the full resolution file. Matt has one of the best tutorials on this subject ever. And I looked at it, and there are different aspects of that video that, like, when I create proxies, I don't create them like him. And I asked him, like, how do you approach creating tutorials on YouTube? And this is where that self-doubt thing comes in the whole imposter syndrome, where I look at Matt's video and I'm like, look, if somebody really wants to know how to create proxies, I would send them to that video. I've created a couple of videos on proxies, but they've been about specific cameras, like how to create proxies from Red cameras, how to create proxies and manage them from Sony cameras, but not anything like a general proxy video like Matt did. And when Matt approached the subject, he actually told me a whole story about 3 different videos that he made up into the point that he made that proxy video. And those like 4 videos or 3 videos combined like equal, I don't know, like 25% of his whole YouTube views. But he told me, he was like, look, no one's going to teach something like you because you are unique. And when it comes to specific things like that, he's like, if you want to create a tutorial on something, then you should create a tutorial on something. Like, there are so many different tutorials on how to, I don't know, add a title in Premiere Pro, or how to do, like, a good case in point is when I was interviewing Lizzie Pierce. When I talked to her about it, she was like, look, everybody has a tutorial about the triad in photography, where it's ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. But obviously each person can approach that topic in a different way, and different people want to learn from other people, like if they might like certain people's tutorial style. And after hearing that from both Matt and Lizzie in person, I was like, I just decided, all right, when I create something, I want to do as much due diligence as possible to make sure that I'm not creating a tutorial that's like, this is the worst way to do it. And even so, I'll create a tutorial, and some of the initial comments that I'll get are, did you know you could do it this way? And I'm like, no, I didn't know I could do it that way, but thank you. I'd like, and sometimes the other ways are faster. And the tricky part with YouTube is when you create something, you can't like take it down and then like re-upload it, which you could do that, but then you're just going to lose all of your initial view velocity and everything. So my initial advice to anyone that's looking to go and create content where it's educational is to not worry about the whole tutorial aspect. Like, don't steal other people's concepts or ideas, and like maybe credit them, because if you're completely like taking some idea or something like that, but if you can teach it in a way that adds to the conversation, then do that. A good case in point was the last video I just released. I put out the video. It's about the Sony ZV-1. If you are on YouTube and you do cameras, then you've probably seen something. Sony sent out their newest model of a camera to any and everyone. And my very first words in that video are, this is a review of a camera that I've never used before, but I'm going to do the review anyway on the specs because I just love Sony cameras. And I said something along the lines of like, I'm not a cool enough YouTuber yet to like get the camera, but I'm just going to do the review anyway. There's two things that I want to bring up with this. That whole point of constraint, for me, I want to put out a video a week minimum. And I was reaching my deadline of not getting out a video. I had a whole video planned, but then the ZV-1 dropped, and I was like, oh man, if I don't create a video right now about it, then it's just going to be old news when I do finally get around to making it. So I was like, I pivoted, and because I had the constraint on myself, or the rule on myself, to hold myself accountable to one video a week, put the video, I created something. I'm just in front of a microphone, in front of a camera, talking to the camera. I pulled some footage from older videos where I was using a similar camera to the Sony ZV-1 to talk about aspects, but I brought my own approach to that review. The cool thing is, the first 40 views of that, one person was the most important because he was an exec at Sony. I get an email, my video hasn't even hit 100 views yet. I get an email from one of the execs at Sony, and they say, hey, so you don't think you're cool enough to get a camera from Sony or for us to talk to you? Well, now I am with Sony. I've had a couple conversations with them, and they want to work with me. So the biggest thing that I can tell you about that is the whole imposter syndrome, getting over that, creating your content. Two, the format of holding myself accountable was able to put me out there to make the video. And I just like consistency, man. I like, if you continually put out content, some videos are going to be better, some videos are going to be worse, but I cannot stress the idea behind, you never know who's watching. And within the last couple of weeks, I've had like some really cool people reach out to me that I had no idea was watching my content. But you never know. You never know who's watching your content. And so my biggest piece of advice there is just like, yes, create, but also put something in place to hold yourself accountable to creating. And I guess it could be a little hypocritical in terms of with my own podcast, like I haven't posted a podcast for so long, but the reason being is because of that aspect that I'm trying to create a formula for my podcast in a way that gets valuable information to the listener in an efficient way that makes it best for me not to have to sit there and edit my podcast down to just the valuable parts in that whole aspect. Hopefully that answers your question.
No, I think so. I think so. When it comes to views on YouTube, I think one of my takes there from you talking is that it's not necessarily about having the most views, but sometimes it's about having the right viewers watching your videos instead. And one thing too, though, is in terms of videos, and especially the types of videos that you produce with helped style videos with your tutorials, is I have two buddies, as most people do. And when I was doing prep for this podcast, I ended up when I was looking on your channel, you have I think you had 100,000 views in the last month. But when I looked through all of your videos that you'd posted in the last month, I think there was one or two that had more than 2,000 views. So like how important is creating like how important is it to you to remind yourself
you
post this?
you just hit you see me. So the what a lot of people don't recognize is I take a big hit. This is my whole strategy right now. I when I put out videos, they're on topics that do not get initial view velocity. If you look at my video that's how to type emojis on a Mac keyboard, right? That video doesn't have like any views right now, but I put so much effort into that video that there's no way that the algorithm can deny the quality of it over time. So my strategy is you're I'm so glad you caught on to this. Is that I try and put as much effort into each one of my videos that I put out now. Now, the video that I did about the Sony ZV-1 is just me sitting in front of a camera talking about a thing, and that was just me holding myself accountable to like I how do I still make a video that's like about this topic where I can still say something, kind of have the quality that I want, but move on because I need to get out a piece of video this week. And that's what it looks like. Sometimes other videos will look much more quality than some, but for me, like I said before, I am spending so much more time on what a title says and what the thumbnail is before I post to create the idea for the video. And that like the idea of the video and the title of the video is the actual impetus to creating a video as opposed to the other way around. I try and have a happy marriage of like, okay, I want to think about this. How do I do that? But for me, all of the views that I'm getting are on the back end. So I'm so far down. Well, I just released my 300th video, and now I can see what works and what doesn't a year, 2 years in. I can see like, okay, if you put as much effort into a video as possible and you try and give the most succinct, efficient way and add your personality and do whatever that may be, over time, the algorithm or Google or whatever it may be will reward you. And maybe the videos that I put out right now won't get X amount of views because they're not the hottest kid on the block. But, people are going to want to know, how do you format a hard drive for Mac? How do you take a screenshot on a Mac? How do you record VO in Premiere Pro? These are simple tasks that maybe a lot of people already know how to do, but they are continually going to be something that somebody looks up on the internet. So my content right now is way more geared towards search than initial views and velocity. I'm so glad you brought that up because that's like this is the biggest thing. That's the biggest pivot in my content. That's the whole reason why I explained why I dropped kind of the podcast for the time being, because I can't approach that in a way that I can like say, okay, when you see the title of this video, this is what it's going to deliver on. And I have a whole back catalog of my video podcast that I could go through and maybe segment out those and create the highlights. I could, or I could just spend time creating the videos that I want to create right now. And I that's where I'm at. So the biggest thing to me right now is that I'm getting views on those videos, and I can see that I'm consistently getting views on the videos that I release. So the last like 5 to 10 videos that I've released may be on hyper niche subjects, but in my analytics, I can see that, oh, it got 5 views today. Oh, it got 10 views today. You know what it's going to do tomorrow? Oh, it's going to get 5 views today. Oh, it's going to get 10 views today. You know what it's going to do the day after that? Oh, look, it got 11 views today, 12, 15, 50. And then like the biggest case in point to this whole thing is like my how to take a screenshot on Mac. That is the worst video I ever put out in terms of initial views. I mean, it's how to take a screenshot on Mac, right? It's like a minute long video, and I tell you right in the beginning, it breaks all the laws of trying to make a 10-minute video for YouTube. It's like I want to say like a minute long video, and it tells you how to do it right in the beginning. Now, for me, if I'm a person looking for something, how to do something on the internet, then I try and approach it from the viewer's point of view. Like, I'm really going to get hurt in the beginning because I tell somebody how to do it in the very beginning of the video. If you look at my how to record VO in Premiere Pro video, I tell you, if you really know what you're doing in Premiere Pro, I tell you how to do it in the first couple seconds of the video. And then for those people that want more of an explanation, you can stick around for the whole video. And for people that don't know much about YouTube, they really adore watch time, and videos like that may not get watch time because people get the information right off the bat. But for somebody that's creating tutorials, I just try and give you the information as soon as possible. Getting back to my how to take a screenshot on Mac video, the first 180 days or whatever, like I think 90 days, 90 to 180, somewhere in that space, that thing got like 2 to 3 views. And then all of this, like when I first released it, it got 45 views, which at the time for my channel was horrible. And now that video gets like 300 views per day. Just because I can't say, I'm just like, from my analytics, I can tell you that what's working for me is thinking of the user first and what would be good for them. And obviously, that's probably what YouTube and Google is thinking. But when you hear about certain aspects, the best way to go about creating content for YouTube at this point in time would be something that's like 10 minutes long. And it does both. It gives people a reason to click that video, but then if you're good, you can keep their attention for that full 10 minutes. And that's the winning part about it. For me, I'm like, I don't know if it's like ADD or whatever, but I like, for tutorials, it's kind of hard to do that, especially if somebody wants a simple task. So for something as simple as taking a screenshot on Mac, I try and make it as fast as possible, but then at the same time, just try and like add personality and do something within like a minute that like, hey, if you like how I did the things, you could hit subscribe. So hopefully the videos that you see now that only have like 100 views, 200 views or whatever, if you were to go back and check them 3 years from now, hopefully they have more views.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, clearly it's working, right? Like your channel's grown to over 17,000 subscribers. And so like so I'm curious as to, with creating a lot of tutorial videos, like how many people then subscribe to the channel after that? Because with a lot of tutorials, people are just looking for a fix to their problem and then they're gone again. It's like, how do you then convert that person from just a viewer to a subscriber when they're just coming to your channel to get an answer to one single question?
I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, I can tell you, no, truly, that's what I don't, it's what I'm still trying to figure out. And the big thing about it too is that I would say the best version of what you're asking is I get comments all the time about, oh, hey, I saw you pop up for X tutorial when I was searching for it, so I clicked on yours. Or I was like, I was glad to see that you did a tutorial about this, so I watched yours. That's the aspect. But the other part of the spectrum, the type of viewers that I have or the type of subscribers that I have for the most part are people that subscribed from some sort of task that they were looking how to do. The biggest thing there would be like, if they are good or if they want to learn more about a specific subject and they keep looking it up on something like Premiere Pro, maybe I'm still there for a different kind of thing. At this point, I'm getting different aspects where I now I'm consulting people on how to set up their studios for a better lighting and a better like camera, or different recommendations like that, on top of like if they wanted to set up their video podcast and other things like that. So I will say it that also comes down to the whole numbers game, where now I have people approaching me to do consulting for other aspects. And when you do things like that, like consulting, you can see um, actual issues that are happening on the ground, as opposed to sitting behind a computer screen coming up with different tutorials and things of that nature. Because most of the stuff that I create was material that uh, challenges that I had. But now, when people approach me with certain questions, or when I approach a different type of issue in the real world, I'm like, oh, I never really thought about that, or oh, I never really saw that as an issue. And now I can see it from other people's sides. It's cool that people want to like reach out to me to consult about certain aspects, but it also gives me another avenue of like, oh, this is something that people are experiencing. So yeah, that's it definitely I the other end of it though is that when I do post a video, it's like it, the interaction and everything isn't as much as if people were uh loyal to a certain um YouTuber that like you want to follow them for their story or who they are, that kind of thing. So at this point, my whole premise is just how do I provide the most amount of value that I can to my audience, and then hopefully that comes back with people want to watch some stuff.
And I mean, people have watched some stuff. Like your channel as a whole has 1.5 million, over 1.5 million views.
Mhm.
Have you ever taken time to think about that number and just reflect on
Oh yeah,
1.5 million people have watched your videos?
yeah. At this point right now, well, yeah, it's kind of weird because the pandemic's still going on, but at this point, it's like 11,000 people are viewing my channel every 48 hours, which is like mind-boggling. Like during the peak of home pandemicness, I think that was up to 20 or like 23 or something. It was like something crazy, and I was like, that's so weird that that many people are looking at my face right now. I had the same conversation with Nick Ivey, another creator. You should have him on the podcast. He's an awesome painter. He he had a couple of videos blow up, and I like just talking to him about this same concept of how do you like, it's just weird that we're having this conversation right now, but somebody else is also having an interaction with me somehow by looking at my face right now and like learning from me, which is really cool. It's a very cool concept, and glad that the internet exists.
Mhm. I mean, I could talk to you about YouTube for forever. I think I wrote down more questions that we have time for, but I want to fast forward to the last question. I ask everybody this question, and it's not YouTube related. It's more so just to whatever you want. And so it's not me asking the question. Technically, it's you asking the question, but it's not to me. So imagine you have this crystal ball. You can ask this crystal ball any question, you'll get the answer. What is one question you want to know the answer to?
Uh, mm, I mean, do I ever end up getting a mansion on the water?
All
There
right.
you go. Do I like
Fair enough.
do I put in enough work and effort in my creating endeavors that I end up reaching my goal of or my material goals, I'll put it that way. But my wife and I always wanted to get a or always not wanted or want to get a house on the water at some point in time. So that's one of the goals right now, and hopefully through doing the things that
Awesome.
I'm doing can provide.
Yeah, it'd be awesome. But I want to thank you so much for taking time to be on this podcast. I want to give you the floor. Where can the people find you? Plug anything and everything you got right now.
I'm at Javier Mercedes X on all things social, and just Javier Mercedes. That's Javier, and then Mercedes, just like the car, on YouTube.
Awesome. I'll make sure everything's linked in the show notes down below. And I want to thank you once again for listening to this podcast. Whether you've listened the entire way through, you only listen to bits and pieces, I really appreciate taking time to check this out. Everyone do me a big favor. Go and follow Javier on Instagram. Check out his YouTube. I'll make sure everything's linked in the show notes down below. If you'd like to follow me, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at the Jacob Kelly. Feel free to come and say hello. My DMs are always open. And if you'd like to follow the podcast, you can find us on Instagram at My Social Life Podcast or YouTube by searching up My Social Life. Thank you once again for listening, everybody. We'll talk soon.